Okay, Biz 101 students, today we're going to be diving into Chapter 2, which is all about the world of ethics, how we understand the difference between right and wrong, and in particular, in a business context, how we understand how to make good and ethical decisions for all the stakeholders of our business. That can include us as business owners or members of that business community, maybe employees, but also customers and society writ large, people who could be affected by the types of decisions we make. So why is this stuff important? We're going to be diving in today to a number of discussions. What we also want to think about is what drives our ideas of right and wrong. So what changes the way one person looks about ethics versus another person? In addition, how can we make sure our businesses are ensuring ethical behavior? Sometimes people have opinions or belief systems, and they also have behaviors. You can't necessarily change somebody's beliefs. You can certainly change their behavior. Then we're going to get into what the responsibilities of companies are. Are we responsible just to make a profit? Or are we responsible for something more in our society? And how are those perspectives changing based on generations? How do businesses meet these kinds of requirements and commitments to different kinds of stakeholders? Stakeholders ranging from people who work for the organization to people who buy our products. And what are some of the trends in society these days? What are some of the things we're seeing change and grow and develop? So what is ethics? Ethics in essence is the idea of right and wrong. It's not necessarily a universal concept. There are certain things that sort of transcend culture, for example. Most cultures of the world, most countries of the world, it's wrong to steal. It's wrong to kill someone. Most people have some consistency, but from one culture or even one subculture or even approach, there can be differences in the way people feel about these. For example, different businesses have different approaches to ethics and what is and is not ethical. Generally speaking, however, the first step in any ethical dilemma is realizing there's a problem. So we see that there is a decision to be made. There's a place where we have to decide between what's good and bad, right and wrong. And just because something is legal doesn't necessarily mean it's ethical. And that's a distinction that is sometimes hard to make with people. So what's the difference between something that is legal and ethical? What is something that's legal but not ethical? We could say, for example, that companies are within their means to make as much money as they want to make without giving raises to employees. Nothing illegal about that as long as they're within the letter of the law for minimum wages, but maybe that's not ethical. If the company's doing well, shouldn't the employees be benefiting as well? And what about something that's ethical but not legal? The example here is, would you steal bread to feed your children? That would be an example of a time you'd be breaking the law with the intent of doing the right thing, essentially taking care of people. So legal and ethical are not the same thing. There are plenty of things that are legal that some people see as unethical. Here's a great example of something that is legal but not necessarily ethical. If you've ever heard of the company Ashley Madison, I hope you haven't actually. This is a company whose tagline is "Life is short, have an affair." Essentially, it's a company that guarantees confidential connections between married people who want to have an affair outside of their marriage. There is nothing illegal about cheating on your spouse. However, most people in the United States and other places in the world would agree that it's not ethical to cheat on your spouse. It's not ethical to lie. This company essentially facilitates their services. Interestingly enough, Ashley Madison was in the news a few years ago when a hacking group got a hold of the email addresses of people using their service and made them public, resulting in a series of suicides. People who did not want to be found out for cheating on their spouses. And what came out of this essentially was that Ashley Madison's main service that they were selling was confidentiality, and they could not promise that. So on one hand, the business failed on its promises, essentially to maintain confidentiality, and in reality, the business was involved in something that was legal but not ethical. There have been plenty of instances of the effects of poor ethics, and there are examples, and I'll share videos of these with you as well. The Ford Pinto is a very famous example. The Ford Pinto was a car that was built by Ford Motor Company in the early 1970s. It was very fuel efficient and was meant to take on more fuel efficient import cars. because American cars were in a disadvantage because of the gas crisis. The price of gas had gone up. There was an embargo of gasoline against the United States, meaning that the OPEC producers in the Middle East weren't selling us as much petroleum. And so cars had to adapt by getting smaller and more fuel efficient. So Ford came out with a car called the Pinto. Well, the Pinto also had a unique design flaw. The Pinto's gas tank was at the rear of the car, between the frame underneath the car and the rear bumper. The result was, when you rear-ended the car essentially would explode into flames in a matter of seconds. If you were in the car, it was nearly impossible to get out without getting hurt. That was an honest mistake in design. The ethical problem was not the design of the car. The ethical problem was that Ford knew that there was a problem with their cars when an internal memo to Ford Motor Company went public, where the company had essentially assessed if it would be more expensive to recall and fix the cars or pay out a few death settlements, and concluded it would be cheaper to let people die. There are other examples that are here as well. Massey Mining was a company in West Virginia that essentially knew that they had problems in their coal mines with gas escaping, that there were gas methane leaks within the mines, and without proper ventilation, sooner or later there'd be a fire. They knew it was a problem. They'd been cited for it a number of times and chose to let the mine remain open. There ended up being a gas explosion in which many miners were trapped underground and killed. Enron's a great example of a company where the executives knew that the company was going downhill fast, and instead of warning everybody, the lead executives sold off their shares of the stock, got out of the business, and essentially destroyed the pension plans and futures for thousands of employees. Penn State, all evidence suggests that many people in power knew, for example, Jerry Sandusky was abusing children in the Penn State football program, but the scandal was covered up, and a lot of people ended up paying the price, both children who were hurt and permanently damaged, and administrators who ended up doing jail time for being complicit. Then we had the Firestone Tires and Ford Explorer scandal of the late 1990s. The Ford Explorer was sold with Firestone tires that were de-inflated to increase ride quality. Well, these de-inflated tires also, under hard handling, would come apart, and Ford Motor Company and Firestone both knew about the problem. And finally, we have Bernie Madoff. Bernie Madoff, who just passed away in 2021, led the biggest Ponzi scheme in history, bilking investors out of thousands and thousands of dollars, ended up adding up to billions. And a Ponzi scheme essentially is a pyramid scheme. When you take investors' money, and the higher up you are in the pyramid, the more likely you are to get paid. So in a pyramid scheme, somebody at the top of the pyramid gets two other people to invest in, and they make their money. Those two people get people underneath them to invest, and they make their money, and only the people at the very top of the pyramid are making the money, and you need more people all the time to pay in. Well, it came out in the early 2000s that what Bernie had done essentially was a fraud, and it came to light in 2008 when the housing market was crashing, just how messed up and just how little reality there was in his actual scheme. One of the best case studies in recent memory, however, was Volkswagen. Volkswagen sold diesel cars in the United States that actually were claiming to be very good for the environment. They got great gas mileage, and they claimed to be low emissions. Well, as it turns out, the cars themselves were programmed that when they were plugged into a computer to lie to the computer about how bad the emissions were for the cars. So Volkswagen essentially had orchestrated a scheme to be able to lie about how good for the environment their cars actually were, and they got nailed doing it. It cost the company billions of dollars, and some of the executives actually did jail time. In addition to the fact that people were sold cars that were actually far worse for the environment than advertised, and the environmental damage that was done, people were left with cars that were devalued and were really difficult to resell, and trust in the company essentially was destroyed. These are examples of what can happen when unethical behavior goes unpunished. So these are great examples of what we would consider to be unethical activities in business. So we're talking about, for example, some of it's easy, lying and stealing, or bribing people, all of these things, abusing power. If you are making somebody do something under coercion because you've got power over them, these are all good examples of unethical business activity. But here's one most people don't think of: condoning or permitting unethical action. In other words, if you see one of your coworkers who is slacking off and not giving their all to the team, making everybody else work harder in the process, in essence, you're participating in unethical activity by allowing their unethical activity to continue. So ethics is a participatory sport. So what are some of the key concepts? Justice means that there is punishment, that there are repercussions for not doing the right thing. And we also put that through the lens of, is it appropriate based on our societal standards? For example, in some countries, stealing means that you are punished severely. You could face physical punishment, for example. In the United States, we tend to think that stealing is something that maybe should be responded with things like financial punishment. You got to pay back what you stole. You might even do some jail time, but not necessarily physical punishment. So again, it changes from place to place based on society standards. So that's an ethical concept. Utilitarianism means we're making ethical decisions based on what's best for most people. For example, a lot of decisions about what is and what is not legal are made based on the idea of what's good for most people. Sometimes the law does not take into account what's good for everyone. So that would be utilitarianism. Some people feel like they've been left out of decision making because they were on the fringes of a decision. Deontology means, well, I was just doing what I was told. And at an ethical standpoint, that doesn't really hold up very well, especially in today's society. When we think back, who used that argument? That argument was used in Nazi Germany by people who were serving in the army and did terrible things, such as the genocides, for example, of the Jewish people in Nazi Germany, and justified it for just following order. And then we get into the idea of individual rights. For example, where do our rights end? Where does somebody else's begin? The general societal statement in most free countries is that your individual liberty ends where you infringe on somebody else's. So what about free speech? One of the most misunderstood concepts in the world. In the United States, free speech does not mean you can say whatever you want. For example, you can't in a crowded theater yell fire if there's not really a fire. Why? Because you're putting other people at risk. So there are limits to free speech, and free speech in this country, I would remember this, was intended to protect people who worked for government and being able to vote their conscience and to be able to speak, quote unquote, on matters of public interest, meaning that you can talk about the government, you can talk about what's going on in politics, you can express an opinion, and even if your political employer, if you work for a political office, had a different opinion than you did, you couldn't get fired for it. Free speech is not limitless. It was geared mainly for political concerns. So, in terms of individual ethics are formed by our individual standards and also the society we live in. The idea of utilitarianism means we're making the best decisions we can for the most number of people. For example, if putting a new waterway in serves millions of people but might displace a small species of frog, there are people who might make the argument that it's a better utilitarian argument or decision to serve the people rather than the frogs. And how can you recognize unethical activities? We're going to be talking more about that, but how do you know if an activity is unethical? We're going to talk more about what that's like in the coming section. So how do companies encourage ethical behavior? The first is to have a professional or personal code of ethics. That means that we're trying to encourage people to know that our company is ethical. We operate by good standards. We set examples. Our leaders, for example, lead by example. They walk the walk. They just don't talk the talk. Here in the School of Business, for example, at St. Francis University, my boss is a guy named Dean Fry, Dr. Randy Fry. Whenever he talks about serving students, he doesn't just talk about it. He does it. He leads by example. But then we also can train people. Again, you can't change somebody's belief necessarily, but you can change their behavior. You can tell people what they should or shouldn't do in terms of the way they should treat people. And that results in what we refer to as an ethics code. An ethics code means that we're putting down in writing what we feel is right and wrong. An integrity-based ethics code means that you're encouraging people to do the right thing because it's the right thing, and to encourage them to change their ways of thinking, or at least reinforce positive forms of ethical thinking. A compliance-based ethics code means we don't care what you believe, you're going to do what we believe is right, or you'll get punished. The answer, which is more effective, it depends where you work and what your personal belief system is. The takeaway from this point, however, is that you can change behavior. You can't necessarily change somebody's beliefs. So if you can remember that, you'll get the concept on this particular issue. So here's the thing about ethics codes. I think that having an ethics code that you don't enforce is worse than not having an ethics code at all. Why is that? Because it lulls us into a false sense of security that we actually are doing something with ethics. Well, we wrote this nice ethics code, we wrote this great statement. If we're not enforcing it, we're not actually living our mission and walking the walk, then we're just showing people that our words are hollow and they don't matter. So that's why it's worse to have an ethics statement and not enforce it than not have one at all. You're creating a false sense of security. So again, the role of top management is to set an example, and a code of ethics is a place where we write down what our beliefs are based on ethical issues. And if you've got a compliance with that ethics code, you are telling people to do something and change their behavior. If you've got an integrity-based ethics code, you're actually trying to work on their beliefs and make them do the right thing, or encourage them to do the right thing because it's the right thing. So how do we know? We said we'd be talking about this later in the section. How do we know if we're making a good ethical decision? Well, the first is the feelings test. I always ask my students, for example, if they've ever lied to their mom. And the honest students usually tell me yes. We've all at some point tried to lie to our mothers. How do we feel? We feel that guilty feeling in the pit of our stomach when we know that we have lied. We've said something that would disgrace our moms if they knew that we were lying to them, and we feel terrible. So your feelings, your psychological feelings, the feeling in the pit of your stomach, you know you've done something wrong. And we've also got something called the newspaper and social media test. And what that means, if you got found out in your decision, you made a decision, it got published on social media, it got published on Snapchat or Instagram or Facebook, or made the front page of the newspaper, how would you feel about it? Then we also have some of the other tests I like to put in. Again, legality does not necessarily equal morality, but the idea being, for example, if we have broken the law, that could be a pretty good indication that what we've done is not ethical. What about breaking the company rules? If we've violated our company's rules or policies, yeah, we may have also done something unethical, especially if we've got a good ethics policy. I love this one more than the idea of a company policy even. What would our friends and family think if they knew we had done it? How would we feel about the way they would regard us? That's another good example of how ethics can work or reinforce good or ethical behavior. Well, then we get into the idea of whistleblowers. Guys, even well-run companies make mistakes. And whistleblowers are people who basically come out and report what was going wrong. People who have the courage to report wrongdoing. And that can be a very challenging thing, guys. The reason it can be so challenging is because if you are a new employee, for example, and you witness wrongdoing, are you going to face repercussions for speaking up? It can be risky, especially if you're new or up for a promotion and you've got to report somebody who's got authority over you. These can be very concerning. These can be very dangerous situations. They can be very intimidating situations. We can face blowback, and whistleblowers sometimes have. We're going to talk about that, for example. This woman's last name is Silkwood, and she was a whistleblower for 3 Mile Island, which was a nuclear facility near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. She had been speaking out to government regulators on some of the practices that were happening at her plant, which could have been resulting in unsafe environmental conditions for people because of radioactive materials being released into the environment. She died under mysterious circumstances, and there are those who have conjectured that the company she was working for actually put a hit out on her. This has happened in the past, and there are reasons why we have laws now that protect whistleblowers. Companies are required to have 1-800 lines to be able to report ethical wrongdoing, anonymous reporting. For example, why might you need anonymous reporting? Well, if the person committing the unethical behavior is your immediate supervisor, you can't talk to your supervisor about the unethical behavior if the person committing the unethical behavior is your supervisor. So that's another example. So we use all kinds of training scenarios. This is right out of our textbook. And I'm just going to go through this scenario with you because we've got lots of ethical dilemmas here. So we got Bill, who's a middle manager of a manufacturer in Newark, New Jersey. And he'd been going up the company ladder really quickly. So we had his boss, Dana, who had been pressuring him about annual reviews. And she wouldn't take any negative comments about a certain employee. It seems like this particular person, the supervisor, has a bias toward a a certain employee, and it seemed like anybody who had given this other employee a bad review at any point in time found themselves out of a job. So we got a situation where we've got a manager who might be receiving pressure from his supervisor to give good reviews to somebody who maybe doesn't deserve them. And what can he possibly do? He can keep his mouth shut and give a dishonest review and keep his job, or he might face a risky situation by being honest. What could he do? Well, I would hope this company also had some ways to report unethical behavior. In reality, companies that are that unethical and are wired to be that unethical sometimes result in good people simply leaving because they don't want to take on the culture. That's unfortunate, and we always hope that people will be courageous enough to take on some of these kinds of entrenched corruption, but it can be very challenging to do so. We're going to take on some more direct ethical situations later in the lecture, however. That gets us to something we refer to as CSR, corporate social responsibility. In basic terms, that means that if you're a company, that you realize that you have a commitment to the greater world, to the society that you live in. And companies, for example, who try to make their communities better might even give their employees a chance to volunteer or to be a part of the community. For example, Subaru sees its corporate social responsibility as having zero landfill factories. They reuse all their waste. Trader Joe's deals with organic food, and then we've got lots of hotels who are being responsible to the environment by asking us if we'd be willing to reuse our towels and to use less water, for example. Those are great examples of corporate social responsibility. Now, there's a number of layers in the pyramid of corporate social responsibility. The foundation is your economic responsibility. We've got to make sure, in terms of corporate social responsibility, our company needs to be profitable. Our company needs to make enough money to survive and pay its employees and to honor its obligations to its customers. Next, we have our legal responsibilities, which means we have to make a safe product. We have to make sure that we are not poisoning our environment. We need to make sure that we're doing good by the letter of the law. Then we get to the next level, which are our ethical responsibilities. That means that we're providing an ethical product or service. So, for example, once we've gotten to this point, if we're a company that sells cigarettes, we might be making money. We might be within the letter of the law, but we might still be shirking on our ethical responsibilities by promoting a product we know to be bad. And finally, the smallest part economically on the tip of the pyramid, you notice every time we go up, we're dealing with a little less money and a little more philosophy, might be our philanthropic responsibilities, meaning what are we going to donate? What are we going to put back into society and charity as a whole? So a pretty good example of how this all fits together. So some of the challenges to corporate social responsibility, first is behavior that's either illegal or irresponsible, and a great example is the Ford Pinto. Making a car that is unsafe when you didn't intentionally make a car that was unsafe, when you made a car unsafe accidentally, is not necessarily unethical. Anybody can make a mistake. Choosing to not correct the behavior, however, is both irresponsible and illegal. And then you get into irresponsible but legal behavior. And that means, for example, yes, we know it's still legal to sell cigarettes and I hope nobody who's watching this is still smoking because it's so bad for you, but it's still legal. And then we get into legal and responsible behavior, which is the best of all worlds, meaning we're doing the right thing by the letter of the law, and we're also doing the right thing in terms of taking care of people. So the components of social responsibility come down, guys. We have to have profitability. We have to be legal. We have to look out for the well-being of society writ large. And we also hope that we're putting good and positive contributions back into society. An example of legal but irresponsible behavior, again, my best example for you would be selling cigarettes. We know how bad they are for us. So who are we responsible to in terms of CSR? We're responsible to stakeholders, people who own shares of stock in the company or people who work for the company. We're responsible for employees. We're responsible to the people who buy our products or our services, our customers. We're responsible to people who would invest in our company. And we're also responsible to society as a whole and to make sure that we're not poisoning our own environment. These are places where CSR comes into play. Guys, these are examples of actual products that got sold over the years to all age groups. What you see in the upper left, those are lawn darts. If you've never seen these before, guys, those are about 5 to 10 pounds. They're sharp metal objects. And the way you played lawn darts is you set up a plastic hoop on either end of a yard and you threw those up in the air and try to land into the plastic circle. It's kind of like a game of horseshoes, except that pointed end could easily go through somebody's skull, so they were taken off the market. The lower left, we see the Chevy Corvair. The Chevy Corvair was a rear-engine car. That was not the most unique feature, however. The car had an aerodynamic problem that at certain speeds, the rear end of the car would lift off the ground and the rear wheels would actually fold underneath the car, causing it to be impossible to control. On the upper right-hand side, we see the ever-popular Cabbage Patch doll. This one, isn't it adorable? Well, it was really adorable when it would get caught in children's hair because it had metal gears in its mouth to eat fake food and also tended to try to eat children. In the middle, on the bottom, we've got the old pull-off pop and beer tabs. When you pull that off a can of soda, sometimes a piece of metal would land inside the drink and people would accidentally consume it. And finally, if you're a Star Wars fan, you recognize the lower right-hand side. That's Boba Fett from the Star Wars franchise. The Boba Fett figure was supposed to ship with a missile on his back. That figure was about 3.5 inches tall. The missile was tiny and could easily be launched into a child's eye or down their throat, so it never made it to market. Those are all unsafe. It gets better, though. How about the Magic Pistol, which was sold to children in the 1950s? It was essentially a flare gun, and everybody's favorite, the Atomic Energy Lab from Gilbert. Yes, you actually could play with radioactive isotopes in your home and order them through U.S. mail in the 1950s. Times have changed. So what conflicts can arise between stakeholders? Well, there can be all kinds of conflicts. Stakeholders, in particular shareholders, want profit. People in the 21st century are more into the markets than they've ever been. Sometimes, guys, companies can increase their value by restructuring and laying off people. So there are times that we're choosing between people and profits. There are times we can make products less high quality and higher profit margin. Could hurt our brand in the long run, but we can make a quick buck. So sometimes it's a big ethical problem to decide if we're going to emphasize quality over cost, if we're going to emphasize people over profit. These are all big issues that we have to counter. There can be conflicts, and anytime companies have put profit over safety or people, bad things often happen. One of the great examples I can think of, Toyota in the early 2000s set a goal to be the world's largest automaker, and they made it. At the same time, they were cutting corners on quality, which resulted in an issue where they had cars that would accelerate because the accelerator pedal would get stuck. It was a design defect, which resulted in a number of lawsuits. Volkswagen, right before the diesel scandal, had set their goal to be the largest and most profitable automaker in the world, and they achieved it until they weren't. And the reason that they lost their title was because of Dieselgate, the big diesel scandal. So sometimes companies put profits ahead of doing the right thing by consumers and society writ large, and all of a sudden, the conflict between making money and doing the right thing results in companies falling from grace. This happens all the time, guys. We've got plenty of case studies about it. So what about corporate philanthropy? You remember that was the top of the CSR pyramid. It is the idea of giving money for the sake of doing good things by society writ large. And it means you can support a cause that your company cares about. It's different than CSR. CSR, at its root, is really the idea of being responsible, making safe products, doing right by society and the environment. Corporate philanthropy means you're giving to a specific cause or even an advocacy group. I'll give you an example. Apple has corporate social responsibility in the fact that they're trying to make products that are as environmentally friendly as possible. But their corporate philanthropy, Tim Cook, the head of Apple, happens to be married to another man, and Apple gives charitable contributions to causes that support gay marriage and gay rights. That is their corporate philanthropy, and it is different than corporate social responsibility. That is one example. Then we get into social investing, and that means you, when you invest in the markets, can choose what companies you want to invest in. For example, a few years back, Harvard decided they were no longer investing their funds for things like pension plans into petroleum or tobacco stocks because they felt that those are bad for the environment and society. So you can invest in companies that you believe in and avoid those that you don't. That's an example of social investing. And by the way, you can also do social lending, for example, to companies that are trying to do good things. Companies can issue bonds and you can lend money to them. And then you have, again, this goes back to Tim Cook's strategic giving. You might be, for example, trying to lobby a particular population. For example, you could donate to charities. If you were a company that produced products for the blind, you could donate to companies that do services for the blind, for example, or anything that happens to be tied to your company or to your company's beliefs. We have what we refer to as a social contract, which means there is an unwritten contract between the company and the employee. In other words, it's the same deal. You have a social contract with me as an instructor. We have expectations of each other. You guys expect that I'm going to be fair, that I'm going to be honest with you about my grading, that I'm going to invest my energy into you as people, and you have the right to expect the same thing from companies, that they're going to invest in you as a person, that they are going to treat you fairly and compensate you fairly. Now, why do younger generations have less of a belief of the social contract than maybe older generations do? Well, here's my theory. People who are younger, for example, lived through the financial crash of 2008 and now the financial crash of 2020 and saw their parents get laid off. People who were loyal to their companies and weren't rewarded with the same kind of loyalty from those companies. So they're saying, why should I be loyal to somebody or to a corporate structure that did not take care of my parents when they needed that kind of loyalty and support? And so I think that's a big part of why there's a difference in philosophy, perhaps, between generations of people in regard to social contracts. So when people aren't happy at work, it costs money. What kind of money does it cost? Well, here's a great example. We're talking about, when I say 450 or 550, that is in millions of dollars, not $450. 450 to 550 million per year. And why? Because people phone it in. People steal from the office. People come in late and leave early. Or they take boxes of pens. Or they screw off on social media all day instead of doing their job. We call this presenteeism. Why is presenteeism worse sometimes than absenteeism? If somebody's not there, if somebody didn't show up for work, we know we can't expect them to do something. They're not here. Well, if we see somebody sitting at their desk and they're phoning it in, we might have the false belief they're actually engaged. And that's why sometimes presenteeism can be worse than absenteeism. So again, presenteeism means showing up but phoning it in. It's different than absenteeism, maybe even worse. So how do businesses carry out their social responsibilities? By walking the walk, by being transparent, by making sure we're making safe products. Corporate philanthropy is giving to charitable causes. And also we get into the idea of even giving to strategic causes as well. And I leave it up to you to see if you believe that a company's only responsibility is to make profit. I think personally that the companies have more responsibility to society as a whole, and I think more people are starting to think that way based on learning about things such as Dieselgate. With the internet, bad news travels fast, and all of a sudden we're more aware of what the companies we buy from are up to. So yeah, it's not just about profits these days. It's about what companies we want to invest in, and younger investors want to know more about where they're putting their money. So in terms of global standards, it can get very complicated. From one country to the next, there are different types of standards, and people can unintentionally do the wrong thing when they're in other countries. It's complicated. So, for example, if we're operating in another country, why is so much work outsourced from the United States? Well, the biggest reason is cost. If we look at as we will look at in future chapters, the minimum wage, for example, in other countries is far lower in many countries than the United States. The lowest minimum wage in the world is Mexico, which means we see a lot of work go to Mexico because it's less expensive. Well, we also, outside the United States, have plenty of countries that don't maintain the same level of safety standards. Some countries are using children to mine cobalt for smartphones or cocoa for our chocolate. And when we ship labor offshore, in addition to losing American jobs, we're also creating a situation where we may be putting people in harm's way. Let me give you an example. Apple Computer, everybody's favorite company for their smartphones, offshores production of the iPhone to China. We have a company called Foxconn that makes iPhones for China. These folks work long hours. Folks who work for Foxconn making iPhones and iPads might work 14 hours a day for the equivalent, I think about $3 an hour. It changes from time to time. Well, a few years back, there was a rash of suicides. People could not take the working conditions anymore and were literally climbing to the top of the factory and throwing themselves to their deaths. Now, in the United States, if we had a rash of suicides in a company, we'd probably be bringing in counselors and psychologists and grief specialists and trying to figure out what is driving people to make this terrible decision. Foxconn's decision was to install nets around the base of the building so if people jumped off, they wouldn't fall to their deaths. I can't even imagine in the United States, if that had been our response to a similar problem, the company would have been accused of being completely and utterly tone deaf and not caring about its employees. But that's a difference in a cultural standard. By local standards, that was considered to be a pretty progressive move toward protecting employees. So from one culture to the next, the value of human life is highly different. People who work for Nike in Indonesia, for example, work for very low wages. A pair of Nikes, any Nike you can imagine, that costs over $100 a pair, probably costs between $12 and $20 to produce. A high profit, high revenue because of the use of foreign labor. On the same token, do we want to produce in these countries knowing the conditions under which people are working? The flip side is this. There are some who will take the counterpoint that these are competitive wages for the areas in which we are operating. If all factories in a given region of China, for example, pay 80 cents an hour and we're willing to come in and pay $2 an hour, are we doing well by that population? By a relative standard, we are. So is it ethical or unethical? That's why these decisions are so complicated, because they are not linear, nor are they simple. And that's why global ethics are a tough thing to figure out. So in terms of strategic giving, just to go back to check in, that means you're advocating for a cause to try to make a change. What role do employees have in improving their job security? And by job security, we mean doing the right thing. Sometimes reporting unethical behavior, for example, might end up improving company operations and making the company more productive and more competitive in the long run. And what about multinational corporations? Do they have a responsibility for CSR in other countries? Again, I leave that to your judgment, but I would argue that they do. We've got to do right by other people. Do we want children doing labor and mining products for us in unsafe conditions so that we can have smartphones and shop? So we're going to do a couple of scenarios here to round out these concepts. Let's suppose you're a junior accountant at Francis and Company, and you notice that the ledger sheets just don't quite add up. Something seems fishy. It seems like money is traveling someplace else or coming from someplace else. So you report it to your supervisor, who tells you not to worry about it. What do you do in this situation? Well, the risk of reporting it is you're a junior accountant and you're taking on somebody who is your superior, who has a lot of power, who, if they find out that you went over their head, could make your life very miserable for you. If you don't take it on, however, and something unethical goes wrong, something is unethical, and you didn't report it, how will that reflect on you in the long run? I'm not telling you that there's not a risk in doing the right thing. There sure is. But in the long run, you could find yourself in a situation where a future employer would not want to hire you because you chose to not do the right thing. So ethics is not always easy. Ethics sometimes comes with risk. Well, how about this? You're a clerk in a business department, and you got recent travel expenses from a guy named Bill, and it looks like even though he was traveling by himself, every night he's eating, he's expensing 2 meals. And Bill is not a large man. It doesn't look like he's eating this much. What do you think he's up to? If I were reading between the lines, it sounds like he's taking somebody out to dinner. Somebody who doesn't work for your company and is not a client. He's asking you to sign off on your expense report. You going to do it? Well, if you are, you're helping Bill commit some kind of fraud against your company. So I would encourage you to consider if you want to make that signature or not. What about Carol? She's been showing up late and sneaking out 5 to 10 minutes early a couple of days a week, and you're stuck with closeout all the time. So you're always working late. You also know that her child has a life-threatening illness, and you think she might be leaving early for treatments. What do you do here? Your first response might be that you can't say anything because this person has a sick kid, and who wants to take that on? And I respect that. I would probably not want to do wrong by this person either, because we all know somebody who's struggling with an illness. That being said, you're absolutely within your right to ask this person, what's going on? You have a right to be treated fairly as well, even if you are willing to stay and do the close-up duties. That should still be a discussion that you have. A discussion that should be above board. Okay, well, how about this? You've got a boss who's been asking for a final report for days, and you've been trying to get all the inside information. It's like a group project. You're trying to get everybody to get all the stuff that you need. And your boss is leaving in 10 minutes. You just got this document together. You haven't reviewed it. You can't verify all this information is correct. What would you do? If you give the boss the report and it ends up being inaccurate, that could cause a lot of problems for him, you, and everybody. In this scenario, I think honesty is the best policy. Tell the boss it's a draft and you cannot vouch for all the information, and that, you might want to let me finish it even though it's late. It's better than it being inaccurate. All right, well, how about this? You're studying for tests in 4 classes, and they're all tough. Somebody in your hall's got a copy of Tonkin's test. What are you going to do? Oh, of course you know what you're going to do. You're not going to look at that test, and you're going to inform Professor Tonkin that somebody's got a copy of his test because you're an ethical superhero. I hope that you are. If you're in that scenario, actually, I hope nobody is stealing copies of my tests, because these tests are something all my students should be so well prepared for, they wouldn't need to see them in advance. How about this one? We've got this guy who is a slug. You work with him, and he makes your life miserable every day. He's trying to get another job, so he's used you as a reference. If you give him a good reference, you can get rid of this guy, and your daily life might get better. So you call for a reference. What do? Do you tell them the truth about what a terrible employee he is? Or do you lie so you can get him out of your hair? Well, if you lie, you might get this guy out of your hair, but what does that do to your reputation? What that does to your reputation in the long run is essentially you setting yourself up that if you end up applying for a job at the same employer, they'll remember that you're the person who gave the dishonest reference, and you get guilt by association. So don't jeopardize your own future by lying for somebody else. And folks, that is our chapter 2 on ethics and ethical behavior in business. I thank you for your time and attention. I hope you have a great day.